Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to the 30th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Welcome to Dallas, Texas. My name is Jim Olivier. I'm from Lafayette, Louisiana, a producer and host of a television talk show that I've done for the past 24 years in Lafayette. And for the last 2 decades, I've spent quite a bit of time working on features and doing a little researching and studying this fascinating subject, the assassination of JFK. I'd like to welcome you to our first panel today. This is going to be an exciting one. It's called Case Closed, and I think it was hatched from a new publication by Gerald Posner called Case Closed, which is the book that is now out today. We will look back last night, for those of you who were here for our keynote speaker and even the introductions by Mary Farrell. There are a couple of things that we'll ask you to do. And one of those things is, during the question and answer portion of each panel that we have this weekend, I think Mary referred to it as, and I think I can quote her, stimulating conversation. I will ask that in those portions of the panels that we do maintain our composure. I know that in the last 30 years there have been lots of emotions, lots of intense emotions, lots of frustrations, perhaps stress that is built up in a lot of areas concerning the assassination, particularly those that you are interested in. But we're going to ask that you conduct yourself in as good a manner as possible. We do have, just for the sake of saying to you, people who are prepared to shut down our panels, turn off our microphones if something gets out of hand, so we'll ask that you please cooperate with us. I think we've got a lively group this year. We've got some very interesting panels, as you'll see in just a couple of minutes. And again, we welcome you to Dallas and this symposium this year. I'm going to begin by introducing our panelists to you. We're going to give them approximately 20 or 25 minutes to do their presentations, and then we're going to allow enough time at the end of that for anyone who has a particular question of any one of the panelists to come up and do so. As I introduce the panelists to you this morning, very happy to have, this is something I didn't need last year, but brought my glasses along today, Mr. Robert Artwohl, who's the head of emergency services at Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Mr. Artwohl disagrees with many Warren Commission critics about the interpretation of the autopsy photos and x-rays, and Bob Artwohl is here with us today. Very pleased to have him. Dr. Robert Artwohl. Okay, he's not the head of the ER, but should be, probably. Our next panelist is certainly no stranger, David Lifton, who's the author of the book that we all know very well, Best Evidence, an exhaustive study of various medical aspects of the Kennedy assassination. His new book on Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way, is going to be released very soon. Ladies and gentlemen, David Lifton. Mr. Wallace Milam is with us on the panel today. He teaches high school social studies in Tennessee, has given over 400 lectures on the JFK assassination in colleges and other forums throughout the country, and is going to provide lots of information for us today on this panel. Wallace Milam. We also have today on the panel Mr. Jim Moore. Jim holds degrees in both history and political science from Arkansas Tech University. The author of Conspiracy of One, he believes that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing President Kennedy, and we're very happy to have again today Jim Moore. And finally, John Newman. John is assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland, the author of JFK and Vietnam, and presently working on his second book, Kennedy and Cuba. It's nice to have again this year John Newman. Okay, we're going to commence with our presentations, and we have picked the order of Wallace Milam to go first. I think that he has visuals for us along with his presentation this morning. Wallace?
Yes, this presentation will be almost entirely audiovisual, and I hope that the lights and so forth are set for that. We will have many of the slides will involve script or text, and I certainly hope that they can be read. I don't know Gerald Posner. I had hoped that today be a chance to meet him. Apparently that is not going to happen. I do want to say in the beginning that I have heard that Mr. Posner has been the object of some attacks, not legitimate kinds of attacks, but that he has been the object of attacks as to his personal life, harassing phone calls and this sort of thing. I think that I would certainly like to go on record as deploring that, hoping that that speaks for the smallest fraction of the research community, and that I hope that that had nothing at all to do with Mr., and I think it didn't, nothing at all to do with Mr. Posner's decision not to be here. I do not know Gerald Posner, but I know his work. I think Case Closed is a dishonest book. I think it is a book filled with errors. I think those errors are deliberate. I believe that the book was written with an agenda in mind. I believe that Mr. Posner's claim that he entered into this with an open mind to take him wherever the facts led him is a claim without merit. And I believe that evidence will be introduced here today and in this conference which would indicate that that was, in fact, not the case. Beyond that, I believe that many of the mistakes and the errors in the book are deliberate. They tend in one direction, which is suspicious. It is the selective use of the historical record and the abuse of that historical record that I plan to talk about. I plan to show you that Posner used material given and cited certain sources and certain pages, and ignored at the same time the contrary evidence found on the same or the adjoining pages, evidence which he had to have knowledge of, but which he did not use. Now, this book has received some of the most remarkable media attention that we have ever seen. 27 pages in U.S. News and World Report, and praise, appearances on TV talk shows. I actually thought that Dick Cavett was going to have an orgasm when during the Posner interview. The single bullet theory arouses strong feelings in people. I never quite expected that. The praise from some of the critical community has been, I think, unstinting and uncritical. This is Stephen Ambrose's comment. My favorite is this one. Posner looks hard at all the evidence. His reporting meets the highest standards. Keep that in mind. We are told at U.S. News that he re-indexed all the 26 volumes, plus the House Assassinations Committee's volumes, plus all these 3x5 note cards. And my suspicion is that while he was re-indexing some of that, he should have read it, and that perhaps the note cards needed to be a little larger in some cases. I want to show you, and you can do this on any page you'd like. Let's turn to just a few aspects of Mr. Posner's treating with the subject and see how he handled it. Let's take, for example, getting the rifle into the school book depository. The long paper bag, which was supposed to be lying there but was never photographed there. Of course, only two people ever saw that bag, Wesley Frazier, Lenny Mae Randall. And it'd be interesting to see how Mr. Posner managed to get the rifle into the school book depository. Of course, Mr. Posner needs for this paper bag to be as long as possible to contain the rifle. And he faces the fact that in order to contain the unassembled rifle, we have to have a bag 3 feet long. And Miss Randall and Mr. Frazier both indicated that the bag was between 2 feet and 29 inches long. How does Mr. Posner handle this? And I like to look for the little things. Mr. Posner is a lawyer, and he presents a pretty good brief. And this is what I want to show you right here in this first example. As the package is put in the car, Mr. Posner says that Oswald laid it in the back seat and the package lay across the back seat. That kind of jumped out at me when I saw that. Because here's the testimony of Wesley Frazier. What part of the back seat was it in? It was in his side over on the far back. And how much of the back seat did it take up? I would say roughly around 2 feet. Now, where in the world did this nonsense about reaching across the back seat come from? Well, by golly, it came from one of those storehouses of nonsense in this case. It came from Dr. Latimer's book, Kennedy and Lincoln, where for some reason Dr. Latimer wrote down here that Frazier noticed that the package reached nearly all the way across the back seat. Didn't come from the testimony of Frazier, came from the testimony of Dr. Latimer. When they get to the school book depository, Posner writes that Oswald hurries into the school book depository early, leaving Mr. Frazier sitting in the car. Obviously, this is a sign of guilt. He doesn't want Mr. Frazier to know about what's in the package, etc., etc., etc. But we go to the record, and we find that Wesley Frazier told Joe Ball that he didn't get out of the car immediately. Thank you. That he was sitting there looking at his watch, and he had 7 or 8 minutes to go. What I was doing, he says, I glanced up. I was watching cars for a moment. I was letting my engine run, getting to charge my battery, because when you stop and start, you have to charge up your battery. So, did Mr. Oswald rush into the school book depository, or did Wesley Frazier stay behind and charge the battery of his car? It's little things like this that you know he found, but you know he doesn't use. Now, the size of the package. When Wesley Frazier was given a replica of the 3-foot bag which was allegedly found on the floor of the school book depository, and Wesley Frazier had said that Oswald carried this bag in his right hand, cupped in his right hand, and it fit under his armpit. Oswald was 5'9", Frazier was 6'1". So counsel asked Frazier to take the replica of the bag and put it under his armpit, and hold it in his right hand and put it under his armpit. But he couldn't put it under his armpit because it stuck up past his ear. Yet Oswald had carried this package tucked under his armpit. Now, how in the world is Posner going to deal with this? Well, it's pretty clever. He cuts the Gordian knot. Frazier saw he carried the package next to his body. And how else would one carry a package? And he transfers the armpit carrying to Mrs. Randall's testimony. This is how Posner reported what Mrs. Randall said, that he carried it under his armpit and it nearly touched the ground. Try that sometime. But that's okay, because Mrs. Randall didn't say that anyway. This is what Mrs. Randall said. He carried it in his right hand, had the top sort of folded down, had a grip like this, and it almost touched the ground. And he was grabbing it with his right hand at the top of the package, and the package almost touched the ground. So Mr. Posner finessed the Frazier and the Randall testimony, and he didn't finesse James Dougherty's. He just ignored it. James Dougherty told the Warren Commission that Oswald didn't have anything in his hand when he came into the building. Now, as you notice this testimony which Dougherty gave back in '64, see if you think Joe Ball would really like for him to have something in his hand. Do you recall him having anything in his hands? Did you pay enough attention to him, you think, so that you would remember whether he did or didn't? And he says, I can put it this way, I didn't see anything. In other words, your memory is definite on that, is it? In other words, you would say positively he had nothing in his hand. And having gotten Dougherty reluctantly to agree to this, but now, this is the bag that Oswald carried under his arm, tucked under his armpit, folded in the middle here. Now, what about at lunchtime? Posner needs Oswald to be on the 6th floor. There are several people who saw Oswald on the 1st floor. Posner presents the idea that he never came down at lunchtime. He talks about the crew that was laying floor and that they take the elevator down and they race each other, and then he writes this. Billy Lovelady, Jack Dougherty, Danny Arcee, and Bonnie Ray Williams remembered Oswald remained upstairs when they took the elevator down. Yep, but they remembered something else too. That Oswald said that he wanted the elevator to come down too. I heard him holler to one of the boys to stop. He wanted the elevator. These are the very pages that Posner cites that Oswald remained upstairs. I believe Oswald was on the 5th or 6th floor. You all close the door on the elevator. I will be down, or something like that. It's not in Mr. Posner's book. On the way down, I heard Oswald say, guys, how about an elevator? But he said something about an elevator. Now, believe it or not, and I found this hard to believe, he relies on Charles Givens to get back to Oswald back on the 6th floor. He relies on the Warren Commission testimony of Charles Givens. He doesn't rely upon Charles Givens' FBI statement, in which here, as you can see in Commission Document 5, Givens apparently told the FBI on the day of the assassination he saw Oswald on the 1st floor. Not only that, but that FBI report creates an itinerary for Charles Givens, and this is often ignored. Not only did Givens not say that he went back to the 6th floor and saw Oswald when he talked to the FBI, he gave them an itinerary which prohibits his going back to the 6th floor. There was no time for him to have gone back to the 6th floor according to what the FBI recorded that he told them on November 22nd. None of this is in the book. Nor is this, the later discovered commission document from Jack Revell, which indicated that Givens would change his story for money. And a month and a half later, Givens changed his story. When he appeared before the Warren Commission, he remembered for the first time that Oswald had gone back to the 6th floor and had confronted Lee Harvey Oswald there. That's the portion that Givens uses. The reporting meets the highest standards. Earlene Roberts, the car honking outside. You know the story, the police car while Oswald was inside. Posner says that didn't happen. Her account is false, relying upon a source, an unimpeachable source, Hugh Ainsworth. He says that Ainsworth interviewed Miss Roberts 4 times on the afternoon of the assassination and 3 times during the subsequent few months. And guess what? She didn't tell Ainsworth about the first 2 interviews about the police car. She told me specifically that nobody was out there when he ran out. Remember those last words, when Oswald ran out. Posner's a lawyer. But what Posner didn't see was the FBI report. Mrs. Roberts' first interview with the FBI 1 week after the assassination, she tells the FBI about the police car, about the whole honking incident. It's not something she contrived later to tell to the Warren Commission. It is something which she told the FBI from the first. And not only that, but when you look at her Warren Commission testimony, she never said that there was a car outside when Oswald ran outside. She said the car came and honked when he was in the house. Where was Oswald when this happened? He was in his room. It was after he had gone to his room. Yes. Rose Cheremy. Most of you know that story. I don't know if I believe the Rose Cheremy story or not, but I don't believe very much in how Mr. Posner handled it. He says that Dr. Weiss, Rose Cheremy never told Dr. Weiss about this plan to kill Kennedy that she knew about until after the assassination was over. Notice his footnote, House Assassinations Committee, Volume 10, page 200. When one turns to Volume 10, page 200, one finds this. Dr. Rice recalled on Monday that he was asked by another physician, Dr. Bowers, to see a patient who had been committed before the assassination. Dr. Bowers told Weiss that the patient, Rose Cheremy, had stated before the assassination that President Kennedy was going to be killed. Dr. Weiss Rose Cheremy didn't tell Dr. Weiss about this until after the assassination because Dr. Weiss never talked to Rose Cheremy until after the assassination. Why did he talk to her? Because another doctor asked him to. Why did that doctor ask him to? Because she had told him about the plan before the assassination. So much for disposing of that one. Same page, next page over, Francis Fruguet, the policeman, the Louisiana policeman. Story is recounted. Rose Cheremy told of the plot, told him about it ahead of time. We have references here on these 2 pages to Francis Fruguet, to Dr. Bowers, both of whom were told about it ahead of time. Mr. Posner, these were obviously left off the 3x5 note card, and only the part about Dr. Weiss after the assassination was contained. William George Gaudet. This is probably Posner at his best. Gaudet, of course, had the misfortune of having the tourist card next to Oswald's in number. Posner admits that Gaudet provided information for the CIA, but he says that Oswald didn't travel with him, there were no other associates, and that the House Select Committee reviewed Gaudet's CIA file, determined he had no clandestine relationship with the agency. Notice the footnote, the citation. The report, page 219. I nearly fell over when I turned to page 219 to check this. This is actually what is on page 219, which Mr. Posner must have seen. Oh my goodness. There on page 219 is the fact that Gaudet told the House Assassinations Committee that he saw Oswald talking to Guy Bannister. But that didn't keep Mr. Posner from writing in his book that there's no credible evidence that Oswald ever knew Guy Bannister. And Gaudet was able to testify, notice this, that he had observed on occasion Oswald at the New Orleans Trademark. I've heard of that place. Now, failure analysis. It's a large part of the book. They, of course, helped in that mock trial, and you will notice in the book that there's a person named Robert Pizziali who worked for the prosecution on that, who is widely acknowledged. 6 footnote references to Pizziali, in fact. No one else at FAA is mentioned. Why is this? Why is there not any reference to contact with FAA? Because had Posner contacted FAA as an entity and asked for their input, he would have discovered that FAA, contrary to what you would gather from reading Case Closed, takes now and took no position on the JFK case. And according to that statement, they provided, of course, expert witnesses for both sides. Roger McCarthy, the CEO of Failure Analysis, in fact, appeared as a witness for the defense. And if you get a chance, you should read the transcript of this Bar Association trial, especially Mr. McCarthy's testimony. It's quite interesting. And oh yes, there is one other little thing that Mr. Posner didn't tell us about the FAA. With all the trajectories which are to prove to the American people beyond any doubt that the shots came from the school book depository 6th floor window and were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald, this book is to convince us of this, and the major thrust of failure analysis work is to convince us of this. One thing Mr. Posner didn't tell us, that when this was presented to the jury, they didn't convict Oswald. But the American people are supposed to be convinced by the same material, book form. Now, I would like to close with the Shaggy Dog story. Jean Hill, of course, was here. She watched the assassination. She has become an important and a publicized witness. And Mr. Posner goes after Jean Hill. Quoting Jean Hill from her deposition, to take a picture of President Jackie, and they were looking at a little dog between them. Hill elaborated later to say it was a white, fluffy dog. When she discovered there was no dog in the car, she claimed to be confused by the white roses, but they were actually red. She later dropped this dog from her story. The esteemed Dallas FBI worker Ferris Rookstool will be seen tonight on CBS ridiculing Miss Hill and her shaggy dog story as part of the CBS 2-hour special tonight. And so keep that in mind as I take you to Love Field in Dallas as the motorcade is about to begin and as Jackie Kennedy enters the car. Here, under the roses in her left hand, is the little stuffed dog. Actually, it's Lamb Chops. We believe it was given to her by a little girl as she walked along the fence at Love Field there. We'll have some video in just a moment showing that. Here's her hand. Here are the roses. We'll have some video in a moment showing the roses before and after the little white dog. And I thought that Jean Hill ought to at least be vindicated a little here. Okay. Go ahead, run the video now if you want. actually, not only does you see it here, but she shows it to the president in the car. She holds it in her hand between them. As he gets the video rolling here, I hope we can see that. And also there is one clip which shows the car, which shows her shaking hands along the fence, and a little girl gives it to her, passes it to her as they shake hands along the fence. In literary terms, this is known as a pregnant silence. Okay, this will run several times, by the way. Here you'll see her in just a second. She will hold it up in her hand. Right, it shows much better right here, just a second, right here. And lays it in the seat. I was looking for something else when I found this a few weeks ago. And I don't know, we'll decide when there's enough video here of this. There's the little ears. It's lamb chop, we believe. There's one moment in which the president looks, she shows it to the president, he looks down at it after shaking hands over here. Now here's the sequence over here as she goes along the fence. I'm sorry that I don't have this very well. Robert Groden will have this for us soon, because some of this comes from video he used some time ago, but I didn't have the original to work from. But this is the moment here in which she's shaking hands. Here she is before and after with our little dog. Okay, that's fine, thanks. Some of you will saw the Frontline thing the other night. By the way, how much time do I have, Jim?
About 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, on the Frontline thing the other night, you saw Mr. Posner do his Dan Rather. Did you about that Oswald attained the second highest rating for shooting in the Marines, that he was a sharpshooter, and that he was a marksman even when he left, forgetting to tell us, of course, that there were only 3 grades of shooters in the Marine, that all Marines are marksmen. And those are almost the precise same words that Dan Rather used, I guess it was in 1978, in a television special. I think Mr. Posner is politically correct at this time. I think there's been a concerted effort on this 30th anniversary to close this case. I think you cannot look at Frontline and the things that have been done and the amount of space spent on this by U.S. News and others, that there's this concentrated effort. And I would like to say, of course, that it is clearly failing miserably. The CBS own polls show that belief in conspiracy in this case is the highest it's ever been. Not only that, but I really believe that the CBS and the Frontline documentaries do no good. I think that when people now see, when they see us down here, they see, that's the gathering of those people who believe in conspiracy. When they see a CBS documentary, I think most American people simply say, there's CBS at it again. And so I think that the documents and the release of the documents will overshadow everything that we see on TV this fall, and probably everything that's said at this conference too. Thank you.
I'm going to make a brief mention, but a couple of things that Wallace talked about in his presentation. At the very time that, and by the way, we're going to make time available for questions and answers after all of our panelists have done their presentation, so please bear with us. At the time that Jim Garrison reopened his investigation in 1967, he called Thomas Burbank, who was the Director of Public Safety with Louisiana, and requested a couple of undercover investigators from the state of Louisiana to do some work for him. Francis Frugier was one of the people that Thomas Burbank sent, and Francis's assistant, who was actually undercover for the state of Louisiana, and I have been talking to her for the last 3 months. She has kept notes and gives a pretty good understanding of some of the maybe misinterpreted events surrounding the Rose Cherami incident in Louisiana. One of the things that I did was to contact Dr. Don Bowers. He is the Dr. Bowers who was working at the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson, Louisiana. Dr. Weiss makes reference to Dr. Bowers as being the attending physician, I believe, the person who admitted Rose Cherami into the hospital. Dr. Don Bowers tells me that that is completely false. He was working at the hospital that year but had left in the summer. It was June or July. So he was not even at the hospital at the time that Rose Cherami was brought in, sometime in November, which I think is very important information. Dr. Don Bowers is in Louisiana. He is a practicing physician, and I have a phone number that I could give to anybody who's interested in talking with him. And Dr. Weiss, I understand, is living in San Antonio, so perhaps someone researching that area would like to talk to him as well. I have also, based on the notes that I was given through this undercover investigator for the state of Louisiana and Mr. Garrison's investigation, been led to several other people who had access to Rose Cherami. A couple of weeks before the assassination, a state policeman, who is now a former state policeman but still working for the state of Louisiana, told me that he picked Rose Cherami up the first time. There were several incidents of picking her up in Louisiana. She was working in Eunice, Louisiana, which is about 15 miles outside of Lafayette, which is I'm from, which is 120 miles from New Orleans, to give you an idea of where it is. She was a prostitute. She was working at a local establishment in the town of Eunice. She was picked up 2 weeks before the assassination by this person that I'm talking with. He took her to the city jail in Eunice. She was then released, and on the night or early morning hours of the 20th of November, when she was picked up again, Francis Frugier took her to the jail in Eunice and called this other trooper and said, "I've got your girlfriend in jail, come see. She has something to say." Francis and the other trooper walked into the cell, and Francis looked at her and said, "Now tell me again, what did you say earlier?" She said, "These guys I was with are going to kill the president." And he asked her to repeat it again several times, and several people in the city lockup went in to hear. I'm going to have a videotape of that testimony and hopefully a deposition by the end of next week. But there are more people who heard Rose Cherami's story just before the assassination. As far as the East Louisiana State Hospital, I was in Clinton the other day, and there's a whole lot more to report on that, but time doesn't allow that in this panel. But there's a whole lot more to the Rose Cherami story than some people may believe. Just thought I'd pass that information on to you. If some people are working in that particular area, I'd be glad to talk with them a little bit later on. But Wallace Milam, thank you so much. And I saw Jean Hill in the hallway here last night. I don't know if she's here this morning, but she is, I'm sure, particularly indebted to you for surfacing that dog.
I told her about it last night, but she hasn't seen the video.
Thank you. All right, our next panelist is Mr. Jim Moore. Jim?
I'll begin by asking you a question. How many of you were here in 1991 when, out of 400 people, I was the lone lightning rod, the only person in the group who believed Oswald did it and did it by himself? Good sampling then. I found it somewhat statistically significant that there were 399 of you against me, and only one of me. Those of you who know anything about evidence numbers might recognize the significance there. I had a near-death experience when I spoke at Ask in 1991. I wanted to mention that to you because I've had a tough week. I just want to let you know that, and I would appreciate being able to leave the hall alive. So please, since there are more of you this time than there were back then, please keep that in mind. I think Wallace made a very poignant political point at the end of his, what's a good word, diatribe? Thank you, Wallace. At the end of his diatribe, that the pendulum swings both ways. Carl Henry, when he introduced my book in 1990, made mention of the fact that political events and our interpretation of them go in cycles. And I think you'll find that my remarks for the next few minutes are largely philosophical and they are not based on the evidence. Like you, my beliefs are virtually unshakable, pending, of course, the discovery of yet another bullet lying somewhere. So I want to confine myself really to what's brought us to this place in time and how, as Wallace said a moment ago, the pendulum has swung. It seems to me that since 1963, we have come, well, virtually full circle. We started out, I think most of us, believing that the Warren Commission was essentially an honest fact-finding effort, and they got the answer right. We went through the era of Vietnam and Watergate and dirty tricks, and we began to come halfway across the circle. And now Case Closed and Random House and CBS and Frontline would all have us believe that the circle is now closed again. I'll tell you in a moment that I don't happen to think the case is closed. I don't think it ever will be, and I think that the title that Random House ascribed to Gerald's book is extraordinarily presumptuous. It was not his chosen title. But I do know Gerald Posner. If you look in the footnotes to his book, he cites me several times. I consider him a friend. I have some faults with the book, and I'll explain those to you in just a moment. But my basic underlying theme this morning is that the case is not closed because you won't let it die. And I think by and large you ought to give yourselves a round of applause for that. The problem, however, is twofold. First of all, we are all engaged in analyzing a 1963 political event by 1993 political standards. And were we all to somehow be magically teleported back in time 30 years, I guarantee you they would lock all of us up. They'd lock me up particularly because I started where you were and came around to the other side of the fence. The other difficulty that we have, I mentioned there were two, is that the evidence in this case doesn't really change. I've spent more time in Dealey Plaza than any other human being alive except Penn Jones, and I guarantee you that it's virtually unchanged since 1963. The evidence, the physical, the hard, the things that we can see, feel, and touch evidence in this case doesn't really change. It remains static, and our interpretation of that evidence changes as time goes on. So I mentioned a moment ago that because our interpretation varies so widely from one decade to the next, the case will never be closed. The problem that you face as conspiratorialists, I'm a bit kinder in my description than perhaps David Bellin or Gerald would be, the problem that you face is that you continue to develop more convoluted theories of conspiracy. The House Select Committee, for example, was supposed to be the be-all and end-all, the one investigation that we had all pressed for, and I was right there with you. Well, it turns out that the HSCA inquiry was deficient, in my view certainly, because they relied on what I consider to be discredited evidence, but in your view because they didn't go far enough. And so we come from the House Select Committee to these scenarios now that the body was altered, that the x-rays and photographs were altered, on and on and on. If, in fact, we had removed the medal from Governor Connolly's wrist when he passed away earlier this year and examined it and found that it came from the base of Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet, I used to call it the bullet that did everything but serve tea. That was not original with me. If we found out that medal came from the base of that bullet, 5 years from now, there would be some of you who would be challenging the chain of possession of the fragments from the governor's wrist and saying that the removal of those fragments was a fake itself. If we were to today exhume the president's body, and when Robert Groden first suggested that to me 3 years ago, I was aghast. I now think it's probably the last ditch, the one way that we'll begin to solve some of the perplexing medical questions in this case. But if we were to do it today, 10 years from now, you'd see videos and books propounding that the exhumation was a fake. So the explanations, the rationales for conspiracy become more and more convoluted as time goes on. I wrote Conspiracy of One in 1989 when it was not fashionable, as it is today, or in Wallace's gender politically correct, to believe that Oswald did it by himself, and there was nothing to the thoughts of a larger conspiracy. When the book was published in 1990, I wasn't prepared for the response, and I don't think Gerald has been prepared for the response that his book has generated either. I still get, perhaps from many of you in this audience, an average of 5 hate letters a week. Well, I won't use the term hate letters. Shall we say critiques? Some of them are more kind than others. I got one last week that started out with, "Dear Mr. Moore, you pompous idiot." And to Gerald's credit, I've only gotten one death threat, which I guess shows you what can happen if you have Random House for a publisher. But the fact is that, by and large, I wasn't prepared for the firestorm that greeted my book, and if it was controversial in 1990, certainly case closed is in 1993. I told Gerald some months ago, I said, this book will ruin your life. Not for the inaccuracies that it contains, and I'm certainly as critical of parts of it as Wallace is. I'll explain that to you in just a moment. Not for the inaccuracies it contains, but because the book will haunt Gerald Posner for the rest of his days on earth, as mine will haunt me. I wrote Conspiracy of One in an effort to rid myself of this thing. And I've really tried in the years since to break my obsession with this case. I'm now, for untold reasons, persona non grata on the 6th floor, for example. I don't spend a lot of time in Dallas any longer. I don't spend a great deal of time reading books on the case. The last one I read was John Newman's. So I've tried very hard for the last 3 years to break my bond to the Kennedy assassination. And it's still events like this that I feel compelled to come and speak to because, first, I knew Gerald wouldn't be here. Secondly, I noticed in the last, I suppose it was the spring issue of the publication of the JFK Assassination Information Center, that one of the organizers of the Canadian Symposium said, and I think I can quote directly, "These people don't have the guts to engage in a fair fight." Well, I was here in 1991 and I'm here today, and I want to tell you that I feel a responsibility to share my views with you. And I know that you feel an equal responsibility to share yours with me. But when I wrote Conspiracy of One, I presented a scenario of the assassination that to me was the only method by which Lee Harvey Oswald could accomplish it, acting alone. I still believe that today. It's the point at which Gerald and I have the greatest disagreement. I don't believe his firing sequence works. I think mine does. So I suppose from an egotistical standpoint, at least, there's our biggest difference. My expertise in this case has always been the scene of the crime and the physical evidence. I can categorically say to you that I spent more time in that 6th floor window than any other human being alive. I read with some disdain the notion in the Ask bulletin that there was some controversy, some question generating around the height to which the window had been raised. And I can tell you that while I have not taken a Mannlicher Carcano up there, I have pointed out the window with a long stick and had no difficulty aiming at cars passing by on Elm Street. I would wonder how many of you have had that same opportunity. I'm sure there's probably a dozen of us in the room. So my expertise lies perhaps in different fields than yours. I try not to get caught up in what I consider the minutia of the case. I think the best evidence is still 3 blocks away from us. I'm delighted to see Dealey Plaza finally accorded the national landmark status that it's deserved for so many years. And I fervently hope that you'll spend some time while you're here in Dallas, for those of you who aren't from the area, really getting into the feel of the place. Carl Henry and I were so proficient with the plaza back in 1990 and 91, we could get down on our knees and show you where the divots were for the old Stemmons Freeway sign. And once you know the plaza that well, you can come to know the crime that well, and I think that's where my real field of expertise lies. I started in this case when I was 8 years old and I lived in Oklahoma. I made my first trip to Dealey Plaza when I was 9. I made my second trip when I was living in Arkansas in my early teens. And then I moved to Dallas to get closer to it. Probably the second biggest mistake I ever made. The first was marrying my ex-wife. Just want to let you know that. But I saw myself as a kid as kind of a, she says that was her biggest mistake too, I want to let you know that. I saw myself as a kid as kind of a blank IBM card. And by the time I was 10 years old, I had a whole raft of people out there punching this card. Mark Lane punched it, Tink Thompson punched it, David Lifton punched it, Robert Grodin punched it, Harold Weisberg punched it, Sherman Skolznick punched it, Lillian Castellano punched it, Dick Gregory punched it. All of those people contributed to who I was as a rabid conspiracy addict by the time I got into college, by the time the HSCA began its work. I wouldn't mind so much that they had all contributed to me if they had gotten together first and organized it, but I have since realized that that's something of a futile hope. I suppose what brought me around full circle was discovering that most of the people who punched my IBM card used, in my view, flawed investigatory techniques. But by the time I was 21, I'd taken that card and stuck it in my head, and that's who I was. So the fact that I'm here sitting before you today telling you that I don't believe what you believe is largely due to my belief that most of the people that I've paid attention to over the years, and I understand there are still a couple of suits pending against me, so I won't name names and produce evidence, but most of the people that I've paid attention to over the years have used flawed techniques for developing their research and their conclusions. If you read how many of you read the USA Today article this morning? That's good. Please read it after I've gone and I'm on my way back home. The synopsis of the paragraph that I contributed to that article, Mark Potok is a friend of mine. I've known him for 3 years. He wrote an excellent piece, and I thought it was pretty even-handed. But the synopsis of the paragraph that I contributed was that you all should get a life. And I sincerely mean that without trying to be a personal development counselor up here today. I sincerely mean that you should try to focus on something else other than this arcane debate. Because if God himself came down and stood before us today and told you that Oswald did it, you wouldn't believe him either. And if you can't believe God, who can you trust? I have as many problems perhaps with the Warren Commission, with Gerald Posner's book, with the House Select Committee as you. Let me share with you some of the difficulties that I have with Case Closed. Wallace brought up, and appropriately so, the Gene Hill story, and he mentioned in particular the white dog account. David Bellin castigated me no end for not including that in my book, but I was certain that whatever Mrs. Hill saw, she saw something that resembled a white dog to her, and being a dog lover myself, I was inclined to give her the benefit of a doubt, so you won't find a mention of that portion of her account in my book. What you will find is my insistence that Gene Hill could not have seen what she says she saw. And if you read Case Closed and then you read Conspiracy of One, you'll discover that the paragraphs that are germane to that issue were lifted almost word for word from my book. I don't have a problem with Gerald borrowing from me. It would have been nice if he had asked me first. I'm certain that if you read Case Closed, you have a great many difficulties with the arguments, the evidence presented. Mine are obviously personal in nature. I go back to my citations at the end of the book, and I wonder why I'm in some and why I'm not in others. And I also wonder why back in 1990 I couldn't find a Random House to take me on, because then I might have made some money from mine. And I'm certain that whatever the outcome for Gerald, he'll emerge from Case Closed as certainly a financial benefactor, if nothing else. But I feel some negativity today towards Case Closed, largely because Gerald hit it at the right place at the right time and got the right publisher, and I didn't. So understand that any bias that I have toward the book is probably contributed to by that thought. I think that the debate, if you will, over, and I think Jim Olivier did a good job of putting this in context when he began the session, but I think the debate over President Kennedy's death has become, for many of you, an emotional issue. And I think that's the tone in most of the mail that I get. You don't attack what I wrote. In fact, I got a letter from a guy the other day who bought my book and never read it and wanted to write me a letter telling me why it couldn't be true anyway. And I began to wonder why somebody would write a letter to an author about a book that he hadn't bothered to read, but apparently this guy felt no compunction about doing that. Incidentally, I answer all the mail I get. It may take me a little while, but I feel it incumbent upon me, and I've told Larry Howard this time and time again, I feel it incumbent on me, if you go out and buy my book, to respond to you. I know there are many people in my position. I don't know what Gerald's practice is in answering his mail, but I know there are many people in my position who don't. I just want to let you know, if you write Jim Moore a letter, you get a response. Now, I say that because I believe that I've gone past the emotional stage, that I see this assassination as black and white instead of carrying the rainbow of colors. And I honestly believe that many of you, and I think this will be reflected in the tone with which we're asked questions this morning, I think many of you are still feeling a great deal of emotion about this case that should long since have passed. I would prefer that you focus that emotion on what President Kennedy did for us rather than on how he died. It seems to me that the one thing that we had when John Kennedy was president that we don't have with Bill Clinton today, well, there's an odd correlation, isn't it? The one thing that we had when John Kennedy was president that we don't have as a nation today is a broad national sense of purpose. I think that all of us can better focus our energies and our emotion toward developing that. I mentioned to you at the outset of my remarks that I tried to write Conspiracy of One with the hope that I could put the assassination behind me. And in a very real sense, at least in my private life, I've succeeded in doing that. This year I've done only 50 radio and television and newspaper interviews so far. This time last year it was up past 100. So I'm really trying to scale back my efforts in the debate. I've taken my best shot at you, and I can't change what can't be changed. I told Mark Potok in 1991 when Ricky White came forward that if Jesus Christ came down to the mount and said that Oswald did it by himself, he wouldn't be believed, and obviously you've confirmed that again for me today. There's an old line in a Rod Stewart song that goes, there's no point in talking when there ain't nobody listening. And I've done my best. It's time for Gerald Posner to do his. I only wish that he were here today to take a shot at you himself, because for all his legal training, he's a very powerful advocate. Let me just say in closing that I appreciate the opportunity to come and share my views with you today. I realize that they are contrary to virtually everyone in the room. But I hope more than anything else that in the years to come, this debate will become even more free-spirited, that you'll encourage dissent such as mine among your enclave. And I hope certainly that you'll never stop digging. I hope that you'll never stop researching. I hope that you'll never stop trying to correct the wrongs that you think have been committed in President Kennedy's memory. But I hope more than anything else you'll take a look inside yourselves and discover why you believe what you believe. And I think if you'll do that, you'll find that the answer to this case was the one we were given long ago. Thank you very much, and good morning.
Just for the record, I was told a week or so ago that there was an invitation extended to Gerald Posner for this panel, and I suppose he declined that for whatever reason. But I think that it is good, as Mary Farrell said last night in the opening remarks. I think it's very healthy for us to listen and give time for these kinds of forum, even if we don't agree with those things. I think that it's a good thing for us to listen to our keynote speaker last night and to stop and reassess some things that may help us as we move along in our search for the truth concerning the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So, Jim Moore, we thank you for being part of our panel today. Thank you. Next is John Newman. John?
This case is not closed. And the people that are in this room, and I agree with Jim Moore, have a lot to do with that, but the real reason that the case is not closed is because of the American people. This case will never be closed until every last file is open. I think belittling the feeling of the American people is part of the problem here, and this isn't an argument about details, although we should argue about them. In fact, I've met Gerald Posner yesterday. We talked about a couple of details. He admitted he was wrong on one or two. I did as well. But it's about his title. It is about his book. It's all about the obsequious and lavish praise that the media has jumped onto this book without having looked at it thoroughly. And the reason is because of the American people, and it is because of their views, and it is because not all the American people, the vast majority of the American people are conspiratorialists. That's really what's going on here, and that's why we have this law. And Jim, I know you said this tongue-in-cheek, but I can't resist this. God has not come down from the mount to tell us Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and nor has Jesus Christ. I haven't seen them myself yet. Now, the empty chair here speaks for itself to me this morning. And I do want to thank both Jim Moore and Bob Artwohl for having the courage to come here. We need back and forth. We need more sanity. We do not need a zero-sum game here, because there are mistakes on all sides of the question. And I wish that we'd had Gerald here to acknowledge those that he's made and to defend those that he hasn't. I am against the thesis that the case was closed, and I want to make a crucial distinction here. There are really two requirements for this thesis, the first being that Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and the second, that he acted alone when he did it. If either of these two requirements cannot be established, the case for case closed collapses. The focus of my remarks today will be on the second of these, that he acted alone. For whatever might be said about the circumstantial evidence on point one that he did it, the simple fact is that we do not have all the evidence that he did act alone. And I can't say it any simpler than this. The public overwhelmingly believes that Lee Harvey Oswald had accomplices. Half of them suspect government involvement. So the case can't be closed until we have the government's files. It's that simple. Now, what is deeply troubling to me about Posner's book isn't just the little mistakes. It's that he violates the very rules he accuses his opponents of violating, and that's selective use of evidence, and that would include focusing on key witnesses' later recollections instead of the ones they made contemporaneously. And not just on small points, I might add, on key points, the medical evidence, FBI reports, and this sort of thing. I believe David has something to say about that, so I won't go into that. I want to focus on the thesis itself. That's what bothers me. And I want to confirm also what Jerry said about the title of this book. What Jim said. Jerry also told me that yesterday, that it was his publisher's idea to use this phrase, not his. And he asked me why we had to pay so much attention to it. And the problem is, that's what this is all about. Is this case closed or not? That's what the media wants. As we sit here today poised, I think, for a great chance at some redemption, a redemption which can only come if we have all of the facts, Jerry's book can be no more than a prediction, and that's all. A prediction by the prosecution. Jerry is guessing. Perhaps an educated one, perhaps not, in the same way that he says in his book that the Warren Commission had no way of really knowing if the single bullet theory was valid or not. It was a guess. When Jerry testified with me on Wednesday at the oversight hearings in Congress, he said that his research includes, quote, a review of the body of work generated by both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Well, I think he made a mistake because he hasn't seen all of that work. There are boxes by the cubic footload he's never seen. Jerry explains that he's been somewhat distracted by the furor over his book, and that this distraction has kept him, has denied him the opportunity really to take a look at these new files. Not a problem, he assured the Congress on Wednesday. He knows some private researchers who have. And he argues and hastens to add that he even spoke with some individuals who had a hand in creating these secret files. I'm sorry, this really will not do. It's not satisfactory by historical or academic standards, and I would think not by ABA standards either. It's pretty common in the media, however. Certainly, there is a danger in such an approach. Allow me to illustrate. One of the individuals that Jerry bases his views on and that he interviewed who created these secret files is none other than Robert Blakey, who, along with Bellin, Gerald Posner argues, saw or knew most, if not all, of these secret government files. I submitted in 1992 in testimony before the same committee that we were before this Wednesday, a document from the CIA which in essence said that about less than half of all the files that they had in the CIA were never seen, not just by Blakey, but not by anyone on the HSCA. And that's just a fact. The foundation, therefore, and these were important documents, by the way. Some were the 201 file of Oswald, and some were files that the HSCA had specifically asked to see. Therefore, the foundation itself is not good enough. We cannot rely upon it to close the case. All I'm asking, and I would ask of Jerry if he were here this morning, is that he accept that crucial distinction. That is the one between making a case and closing the case. If you want to argue that you've closed the case, in my book, you lose. If you want to assert that the case is closed before having seen all the documents, that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, you will appear more reasonable, but nonetheless as an advocate of prediction, not the savior of U.S. News and World Report. In terms of specific areas that are coming out in these new releases, and I must tell you that it's not going very well. There are reasons for optimism. I think mostly in two categories. One would be the Central Intelligence Agency, and the other would be the House Select Committee. In these two areas, we're really starting to get an awful lot of new material that many of you here today would not have thought a year ago that we would be looking at. The FBI has not made one page of its 500,000 documents available. I believe that startled the committee on Wednesday, and it was our understanding that Chairman Conyers intends to call the FBI before the committee sometime in January to find out what the reason for this is. There are files that are being withheld that are extremely intriguing. They bear upon the issue of whether or not, for example, Oswald and Ruby had an association just prior to the assassination. That would be a central issue. And without these types of documents, closing the case on Oswald's associations is a dubious proposition at best. What about the issue of Oswald and the CIA? I spent about 5 months, from 4 or 5 in the afternoon till 10 o'clock at night, going through the 52 boxes of Oswald's 201 file, the CIA file. I think it's incredible what we're seeing. I never thought we would have seen material like this. I'll have a chance to present that this afternoon. Actually, another aside, I did, upon reflection, think that this panel should have been last. We should have seen all the new presentations first this year and then had a chance to assess whether we can close the case or not, but that's not to be. Some quick points I will make about that now rather than to wait completely till this afternoon. It's apparent to me that the CIA has lied about a couple of things with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald, but it concerns most of all their relationship with him. They did, in fact, have a relationship with him. They have denied that over the years. These files make it clear that contact occurred, a debrief occurred, and we know the name of the person who worked in Domestic Contact Division who conducted the debrief. The basis for this, the evidence for this, is not only documentary, but in fact witnesses at the time and the recollections of several clandestine services employees who are now on the record. In fact, I think you saw one in front line, but there are others as well. There is more to that. I'm going to delay going into a great amount of detail till this afternoon. But for me, the idea of, well, the question of whether or not Oswald was associated with underworld figures or intelligence agencies is central to the idea that he was acting alone. If you don't deal with that, if you don't thoroughly vet that issue, you can't possibly say this case has been closed. In making the argument to Congress on Wednesday that we can be confident that the case has been closed, Posner said it was just like admitting that it's true the Nazis did in fact attack Poland to begin World War II. More files won't change the truth about that, he said, any more than it'll change the truth about the Kennedy assassination. And before my eyes began to glaze over, I began thinking about that, how it would be interesting if that had been covered up, that the Poles had attacked the Germans first and somebody made a movie about it. But if analogies are in order, I have one of my own. Imagine your wife, who just happened to have a security clearance, was being, or had been, brutally murdered by a tramp or a hobo, according to the security officials. Did he do it alone, you ask? Yes, comes the answer. May I see the full report on this, you ask, naively. Sorry, comes the answer. You're not clear. You don't have a need to know. Trust us on this one. Do we have all of the key evidence in this case? If not, how can we possibly close it? For the case closed thesis to hold, it is necessary to argue that the secret files do not contain anything of interest or value. I would like to read one sentence from Gerald Posner's testimony on Wednesday. He said, quote, "Many of the potentially most interesting documents may be withheld until the review board, provided for under the law, is ready to perform its duties." I think that statement alone, if it doesn't destroy his thesis, certainly undermines its essential foundation. If I could frame the issue the way I want to, the case is even broader than whether it's closed or open. It's nothing less than whether or not our institutions function and whether the people have faith in them. And for me, that's why it's so important to open all the files before rendering final judgment one way or the other. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Newman. I have been asked to make a very quick announcement that the women's lunch that is scheduled for noontime has been sold out. If you have a reserved ticket for that, then you need to pick it up at the Ask Registration desk, but the women's lunch is sold out, and the badge clips that they ran out of last night, by the way, if you're walking around with your badge in your pocket or purse or something, the clips are in. You need to get that also at the registration desk. If you look to your program, we are due now for a 15-minute break, but only 15 minutes. We'll return, and Case Closed will continue in a quarter hour.